Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're jumping into a legal battle where a landlord's own wealth was actually used against them. And we're going to look at how one surprising court ruling is shaking the very foundation of India's decades-old rent control laws. It's a saying that sounds completely backward, right? Landlord poor, tenant rich. But honestly, it perfectly captures the bizarre situation some property owners in India find themselves in. They own the place on paper, but they're basically powerless, while a tenant gets to use it for next to nothing. So how can a law that's supposed to protect people end up feeling like an injustice? Well, that's the paradox at the very heart of a recent and pretty explosive Delhi High Court judgment. We're going to dig into how one landlord's fight is forcing everyone to take a hard look at this law. All right, so let's set the scene. Our story kicks off with a pretty successful entrepreneur. They've got thriving restaurant businesses in London and Dubai, and they decided, you know what? It's time to expand back home in India. And the perfect spot? Their very own shop in Delhi's super busy Sadar Bazaar. So the landlord does everything by the book. They file an eviction petition to get their shop back. The case goes to a special court for this kind of thing, the Additional Rent Controller, or ARC. But the result was a total shock. Petition rejected. Okay, so here's what's really interesting about this. The whole point of the ARC is to be fast, right? To cut through the red tape of the regular, slower court system and get things resolved. So you have to ask, in what seems like a pretty clear-cut case, why on earth did this specialized court say no? Well, it turns out the ARC's decision wasn't really based on a strict legal test. It was based on a couple of, really surprising assumptions. First, the court figured that since the landlord was well off and living overseas, they couldn't possibly have a real need for the shop. And second, they basically decided that the shop was just too small for the owner's plan to open a restaurant. But this wasn't the end of the road. No way. The landlord refused to take no for an answer. They appealed, and once the case landed in the Delhi High Court, the entire script was about to be flipped. And the High Court didn't just disagree a little bit. Oh no, they basically took the lower court's decision and completely dismantled it. The judgment used incredibly strong language, calling the ARC's logic both illegal and fundamentally flawed. And this is where you can really see the two sides clashing. On one hand, you've got the ARC basically saying, hey, the landlord's rich, and their business plan just doesn't seem realistic to me. But the High Court comes back and says, hold on, their wealth, totally irrelevant, and whether their business plan will work, that's their risk to take, not the court's job to judge. And look, this whole thing became about so much more than just one little shop inside our bazaar. It was a huge moment that clarified one of the most important and, frankly, most misunderstood ideas in the entire Delhi Rent Control Act. And that big idea is something called bona fide requirement. It sounds fancy, but bona fide is just Latin for in good faith. It basically just means a genuine, honest need. And the High Court really wanted to put the focus right back on that simple test. So what's the bottom line here? The High Court laid down some super clear rules. They said the only thing that matters is if the landlord's need is genuine. And need doesn't mean you're financially desperate, it just means you have a real intention. It is absolutely not a court's job to act like a business advisor and say, I don't think you can run a big business out of a small shop, whether it's a cloud kitchen or a delivery service or anything else. And, the High Court wasn't just pulling this out of thin air. They were building on some really important past rulings from the Supreme Court itself, rulings that had already established that a genuine intention is what counts, and that once that need is proven, the owner's right to their own property comes first. Okay, so that's all the legal stuff, but what does this actually mean for landlords and tenants out there on the ground? What are the real-world implications here? Well, for property owners who feel like they're trapped in a system that never lets them get their own property back, this ruling is a huge deal. It's like a ray of hope. It gives them a powerful legal argument to fight back against rejections that are based on flawed or just plain irrelevant logic. And on the flip side, for tenants, this is a bit of a wake-up call, a legal alert. It's a clear signal that the courts are now looking much more closely at situations where these laws meant to be a shield for protection, might be getting used as a sword to hold on to a property forever, basically taking away the owner's rights. Which brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? Is this just a one-off victory for a single landlord, or are we seeing the very beginning of a major shift in how India's old rent control laws are understood? One thing's for sure, it definitely strengthens the rights of property owners, and it might just be the start of a much larger conversation about what fairness really means in a changing India.